Joyce Parker was the service that opened my eyes up to recovery, and like I genuinely mean that. No one had ever, like no other service had ever sat there and actually gone and said to me, like, helped me understand myself. Because when I first came to you guys, there was that I didn't know why I was struggling. Remember, like my assessment, I literally just did not know why I was struggling, and these guys just opened my eyes up to something that I never thought I was struggling with. It was.
I remember. I was going to say, sorry, are we recording?
No, go on.
Yeah, actually, we're rolling.
Oh,
okay.
Right, fabulous. So I remember. I came to you were at Bury at the time to assess you, and I remember. Because we went out as we always go out as a multidisciplinary team to assess anybody who might come to our LSU. And I remember thinking, you really said, I really want to get out of services. But I also remember having these very distinct conversations with you about you saying, I don't know why.
Yeah.
This is happening for me. And us trying to think, well, how would we put that into a context for you? I really remember you clearly saying that.
Yeah, it was something that like I never like had any input and support with understanding. I think because I'd been on PICUs and acute wards, I feel like there's more of a focus on just the stabilisation process rather than when I moved on to Dragon, it was very much about stabilising for the future, not just the there and then. It's about having that continued support so I could be comfortable in the community. And I think I think the support that I was given, I think has shaped me. I wouldn't be sat here right now. I don't think, like, genuinely, I never thought that I'd ever be in a position where I'd actually managed to keep myself out of services. It's been about a year. And
that's such an achievement.
Yeah.
I think that takes us back nicely as well. We were talking earlier about identity, and, what you're saying is for you, the key to be able to plan your future was understanding who you were, to enable you to decide where you wanted to go, and then people can support you along that journey, can't they? So that does take us back to what we were saying and why that's so important. It's really nice to see your how you've related to that.
And I think very early on in my admission, Katie supported me within roles of co-production, getting me involved in induction processes. I mean, there was many a time we went to induction and I was I'd get involved in anything I could. Katie, the support that I received to get involved in the co-production, and obviously the Expert by Experience program then got mentioned to me, and I think that's another key thing that the occupational therapy team supported me with. Actually, fueling my energy of the things that I really struggle with within services. So whether it was like kind of the dynamics between staff and patients, or whether it was boundaries, or whether it was even just simple things like teaching the new cohort about occupational therapy, even things like that. It was Katie found my passion and fueled it in as many ways as she could.
Yeah, but I just recognised your skills because you already had those skills.
Yeah.
You had them, I could see them, and it was just because at that point you were just sort of, I think, stuck with why am I here and in hospital. All I did was like polished the skills that were already there for you. That's what I think. I mean, I remember that amazing business plan you wrote for me for the cafe, which I sent to you, Emma.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've seen... It's amazing. You'd like done a SWOT analysis. I was like,
it was brilliant.
I know, like qualified OTs that couldn't write something like this. And everything that I said to Tom, do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Do you want this? Tom's like, yep, absolutely. Give it to me. I'll take it. I'll do it. And that is why you are where you are now, I think, is because you met every challenge that we gave you.
And I think as well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you identified that some of my anger that I was displaying on ward was out of frustration because I couldn't, have much input into the way my care was received previously and how, different things were ran internally within the service. And I think you identified that frustration and gave me the kind of breathing space to actually, fuel that energy into a positive rather than just keep getting angry. Because, I mean, I was very angry at certain times when things might not go my way, or whether things were not, going the way that I perceived they should, they could be best done.
So from building that skill then, is that something that you still use now? Do you reflect on those strategies and
Yeah, definitely.
still implement them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when I speak to service users, and they kind of tell me that they feel stuck, and I'm like, so what I would literally sit there. I said, what I used to do is I used to go into these ward rounds, and I used to take I used to do my iPad and my pencil, and I used to sit there and write my goals, and then I'd sit there and I'd ask them, and they'd say no. I'd be like, why? Tell me why I can't do it. So then I'd write that down, and then I'd go, well, then tell me what my goals are. And I was a very forward person in my opinions. And then in 2 weeks' time, if that wasn't granted, I'd be like, but you told me this. And I tell every service user, some of them can't unfortunately advocate for themselves. And that's where, our advocacy services do come into play. But, I think that for that in particular, I definitely take that skill. But even, when I'm talking to the staff that maybe we're, new starters or anything, I say, I literally level with them and I go, look, I've been here. I know exactly what it's like, and I know how frustrating it can be for both us as service users, but also as staff. We recognise that actually there is lots of frustration within the.
And sometimes it's not why I can't, it's how I can, isn't
Yeah.
it? And then how you work as a team to enable that.
So I think when you were talking earlier on about building a therapeutic relationship, and I think, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, I said to you really early, like, I will always be honest and open with you, even if it's something you don't want to hear. We had some very, I think, difficult conversations at times, but I'll always be honest and open. I'll give you the reasons why something can't happen. We can think about how we can make it happen, and we had loads of conversations about how do we make it happen. But I'm never going to not be on it. And that's generally how I think. Actually, we've got somebody who's become, and not just you, but every young person I work with is going to become a young adult who's going to need those skills of negotiation, kind of honest, open communication. That's my approach in general. And sometimes it's going to be difficult, but I'm always going to be honest.
I think it's so important to have that open and honest culture with patients, because sometimes it's so easy to fall into the trap of just saying no. And I recognise that, because sometimes it is easier to save, like, for example, we've had very, hard discussions, and sometimes it's just easier to sit there and say no, because you then save a potential, risk incident, because you've had the whole conversation. Whereas I think Katie recognised the fact that not being honest was worse than being honest. Even though I could get really, upset and hurt by the honest conversations, it also meant that I could act. But I think you definitely just recognised that it could be a lot more worse if there wasn't honesty.
But also, how would it benefit you or me if I wasn't really clear and open with you? It does, it doesn't benefit me to say to not be honest with somebody. It's not going to help your recovery if I'm not really clear about why a decision's not been made or why we can't support something. And actually, one of the things we talked about a lot was you would come back to me and say, well, actually, I really want this to happen. I'd say, so then we really need to think about a plan to persuade the team to agree it or do it and let you do it. And then that's something we'd work on. And I do think, we have brilliant advocates at Joyce Parker, but I do think often OT find themselves in the role of advocacy for a young person as well. And every member of the MDT would say that, but I think particularly around risk, I often find myself saying, I think we can do that, and I think we can do it safely. And
I think we do so much about self-identified goal setting that you naturally fall into that advocacy type role, don't you? I think we've come back a few times there, Tom, to the relationship that you built with Katie and with the rest of the OT team as well. Has that made it easier or more difficult for you to come back now in that new role?
I think it sometimes becomes a little bit difficult because I'm so used to having that relationship with the multidisciplinary team, to kind of it could get a little bit frustrating if, you know, you don't go into service, which is expected, to not have that relationship straight away. But I think knowing that it is possible to have that relationship and have that working relationship, I think definitely aids, you know, is more motivating to keep continuing and not just giving up in the first place, because it's so easy to go, you know, they're not being supportive of ideas or stuff like that. But actually, you know, knowing that that culture can be and is accepted, it's so much easier to kind of work towards them goals.
About navigating a change of role as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I picked Tom up from the station this morning, and I even had to think, like, can I pick Tom up from the station this morning? Because I used to be his occupational therapist and now he's my colleague, and it's like navigating that role. And then that's a big change for me, because actually one of the things we talk about a lot working in inpatient services is boundaries and the sharing of personal information. Actually, Tom is my colleague now. You know, and so that has denoted a change in our professional relationship, and that's something we'll probably both have to navigate, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I still find it weird when, you know, I'd walk in, so like if I'd go on a visit, I'd walk into an office and I'd be like, so is there anything I need to be aware of? And I still find it weird even asking that question. Or like getting to reception in the morning being provided your keys and alarm. That never happened. So like, I think even now, you know, a few months on, it still feels so weird. But it's also so, you know, motivating and so, you know, humbling that actually, you know, you guys, you know, services aren't just like gonna let you leave and then never kind of support you again. Because even though I am an expert by experience and I'm still a colleague, the support I'm getting, you know, hearing, you know, how, like, for example, how proud you were of like my you know, the articles that were released.
I read every single one that I could find from Children's Mental Health Week where Tom was speaking, and this morning I've also listened to the radio interview that you did. And when I met him this morning, I was like, is it patronising? I was so proud, honestly. I was like circulating them to the team. I was like, look, Tom's been in the press. I had that moment where I was like, oh my gosh, he's doing amazing things. But I always had faith that you could.
Yeah.
So
it's a good job we've got him here for the podcast now before he's too famous to join us, isn't it?
So, yeah, I think definitely, like, you know, there's still a lot, you know, just for example, hearing Katie like saying that she's proud, it's such a humbling and motivating experience, because, you know, you know, you guys still, you think that you leave the door and they forget about you, but no, like, you know, seeing those, you know, articles and stuff, it shows that there is still that element of care there, and that I know when I return to Joyce Parker to work with these guys, that actually there is going to be, you know, a really great working relationship with them all, and they're all looking forward to working and stuff like that.
Oh, the whole team. I was telling them yesterday, Tom's coming back to us in a couple of weeks' time, isn't it? And everybody's like, oh, but everybody said to me, oh, say hello to him for me tomorrow. You know, so it's the whole team, I think, feel proud of, but we do for every, as I said in the previous podcast, every time we get a bit of information about how well a young person is doing, or that they've taken a little step forward, or a young person emailed me a little while ago for a reference, because I always say, if you've done any of the sort of co-production stuff with me, I will do a reference for you, and emailed me, and it was for a healthcare job. I was just like, oh my gosh, that's 3 years ago. How far have they come? And I don't ever forget anybody. So there's an element in pride in everybody that goes on to do that. I just feel like really blessed that we've been able to keep Tom sort of as an expert by experience working with Cygnet, because of his skills, and that was always what I thought he had.
Yeah,
when he was on Dragon.
And now he's showing you that that's definitely the skills he's got.
Yeah. Maybe one day he'll become an occupational therapist.
Maybe.
We can but try. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
Really lovely. Thanks for joining us.